Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation. We have all been obviously very closely watching developments in Ukraine since February 24th. And I think in some ways, surprised, astounded some days, not surprised other days, with what we're learning from the Russian invasion and subsequent military conflict in Ukraine and Ukrainian defense of their territory and cities. We are extremely proud to have with us today General David Barno, Dr. Nora Bensahel, and Michael Kofman to talk about what we've learned so far in terms of military adaptation and the lessons we're getting out of the Ukraine conflict. It's great to see some of our great friends back with us again. We have been covering great powers competition for several years, looking at ways the United States competes with countries like China, to some extent Russia, in terms of economic dynamics, information operations, and economic tools and other levers. Of course, we did not expect to be covering a large-scale military intervention in Ukraine at this point, but here we are. We have had a lot of recent conversations where we've looked at various aspects of the data coming out of the conflict and have been kind of surprised in some ways to learn about capabilities, to see how new technologies have impacted the battle space. To name a couple examples, we were looking recently at the impact of SpaceX and Starlink's satellite-based internet connectivity and what that has done for the ability of the Ukrainian military, the people, political actors to stay connected with each other, to operate and stay connected with the world. I think in some ways disrupted Russia's information operations plan quite significantly. We looked at the challenges with communications and local cell networks and the impact that's had on the war. And there have just been many, many facets of this conflict which have yielded a lot of interesting observations so far. I'm very proud that we're able to host this conversation today with General Barno, who's visiting professor of strategic studies and senior fellow at the Merrill Center at Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, Dr. Nora Bensahel, who is visiting professor of strategic studies, also senior fellow at Merrill Center at SAIS, and then Michael Kofman, research program director of Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analyses. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your insights with us today. I'm going to turn it over now to Joshua Huminski as moderator to tee up some opening thoughts and then move our conversation forward. But thank you all very much for being with us here.
Thanks so much, Glenn. And I'd be remiss if first I didn't say to everybody on the panel, I'm incredibly excited to be here with you today. I read all of your work prolifically. Dr. Bensahel and General Barno, the authors of Adaptation Under Fire, which is a fantastic study of how militaries adapt in warfare. There's a copy right there. Highly recommend picking it up. And obviously Mr. Kofman, who was in the right place at the right time in terms of just the proficiency and knowledge and expertise of how the Russian military has formed up and has fought and where it's going today. So I'm incredibly excited to be here, if you couldn't tell. I want to open up first with turning to Mr. Kofman, just to give a 2 to 3 minute snapshot of the state of play in Ukraine in terms of the battlefield. Where you see it right now and what things are you most paying attention to at the moment?
Okay, thanks, Josh. Thanks for that kind of introduction. So I guess I'd summarize where the conflict is and a bit of how we got here is that, the initial campaign on Russian side was really an attempt at a quick regime change operation. It failed. It was based on terrible assumptions about Ukraine, tremendous war optimism and hubris. So it was in many ways a bad plan, but also the way it was conducted had real lack of organization and preparation by Russian units, stemming from the actual fact that it was generally kept secret from the force. So much of the force originally really was not organized or prepared for a long war, for a sustained conventional conflict with a serious adversary. That resulted in defeat in March. The Russian forces attempted to reorganize and reconstitute with a more focused campaign on the Donbass, while trying to hold in other areas that they had managed to occupy in the first phase. So with the military focus on the Donbass right now, it's a fairly dynamic battlefield. In the Donbass itself, particularly in the northern part of it, you have sort of a plodding Russian offensive, which has made fitful but incremental gains. You see Ukrainian counterattacks with gains made elsewhere along a front that stretches around 800 kilometers across Ukraine. So you see other areas where both sides are counterattacking, taking territory, trading territory. It's a fairly dynamic battlefield in that respect. Neither side seems to have the forces to effectively engage in maneuver warfare, and so this is sort of settled into attrition warfare by default. It also favors some of the force structure of the two militaries, which I'm happy to get into a bit later. This battlefield and the war itself features considerable adaptation, or for some forces, more of actually returning to the way they train and organize to fight doctrinally. That is, less adaptation and maybe actually beginning to more competently execute those things that they were expected to be doing at the outset of a war that for all sorts of reasons they failed or couldn't put into action. And you see a combination of traditional conventional capabilities with more modern commercial off-the-shelf systems, certain areas of adaptation or maybe innovation on the battlefield, but both sides having challenges with force employment, with scalability, and also issues that are resultant from their force design, the trade-offs they made kind of going into this war. Last 2 points I'll make is that the war has imposed very high costs on both sides. The level of attrition is immense. This is a war where the best elements of both forces have in many respects been lost. When you're looking at both manpower and material, there's the best units, the best trained soldiers have been lost in terms of casualties on the battlefield over several months of grinding fighting with both sides having to depend increasingly on reserve forces, on mobilized forces, on second, third echelon troops. And that on the whole, I think we could say that the local military balance in the Donbass favors Russia, particularly when it comes to fires, but not significantly when it comes to forces. The long-term military balance favors Ukraine, but that's highly contingent on sustained Western military support. And of course, these are just a way of characterizing the military balance trajectory. This is not predictive of outcomes. I always try to stay away from trying to predict battlefield outcomes, particularly in the near or medium term. So I guess maybe that might be a good summary to get this conversation going, and I'll turn it back over to you and my colleagues.
Fantastic, thank you. Dr. Bensahel, in your book, Adaptation Under Fire, you and General Barno fixate on 3 aspects of doctrine, technology, and leadership when it comes to adaptation in conflict. I'm curious, based on what you have seen thus far and what Mr. Kofman was alluding to, have we seen, first on sort of the Russian side, but then also on the Ukrainian side, sort of evidence of this kind of adaptation in this present conflict? And if so, what are you most paying attention to?
Well, I think we have, and particularly on the Ukrainian side, you rightly point out our framework based on doctrine, technology, and leadership. And as Michael just said, there are in the area of doctrine, part of it is reverting to past doctrine, which is adapting to the fact that what you're trying to do on the battlefield isn't working, certainly if you're the Russian forces. But I think especially in terms of the areas of technology and leadership, we've seen remarkable adaptations on the Ukrainian side in particular. When you look at what Ukraine's military was able to do at the beginning of the war and how quickly it was able to adjust and adapt. Part of that, there are many reasons for that. Part of it is extensive US security force assistance over the past several years since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. But I think part of what you're seeing on the battlefield is an incredible ability to take social media and other public forms of information and transform them into knowledge. Now, some of that admittedly is happening with US help, but the ability to make the battlefield transparent to where big Russian forces, masses of forces are, is something we've never seen at this kind of level outside the most classified intelligence estimates. The fact that, the public with cell phones can geotag things on and post that on Twitter has been a remarkable success for the Ukrainian military, particularly in that first phase where they were able to hold off the Russian advances, partly because of the many weaknesses that Michael mentioned. But so that's technology. In the area of leadership, I would just say that President Zelensky has emerged as a leader, as one of the best wartime leaders we may have ever seen, up there on the levels with Churchill in terms of motivating the public and keeping them fighting. Obviously, the Ukrainian forces are incredibly motivated. This is their homeland, and Putin's invasion managed to unite even most of the ethnic Russians behind Ukrainian independence, which was quite a feat, given they weren't necessarily leaning that way before, but his leadership and that extending down the chain of command certainly also is a very big part of the story of the Ukrainian successes so far.
General Barno, I'm curious if you can add on to that, sort of from your perspective, and because I'm very glad that Dr. Bensahel mentioned the transparent battlefield, which you both write about in your recent War on the Rocks piece. Have you seen any evidence of sort of the inverse of the Ukrainian adaptation, sort of the Russian adaptation to this transparent battlefield or environment? Because obviously we're getting a steady stream of video clips from the Ukrainian military who are masterful at the information war aspect of this, but it doesn't seem, at least as of yet, that the Russians have adapted to this environment. I'm reminded of that 40-kilometer long logistics tail that just was sort of sitting there and waiting to be struck almost.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I would agree with Dr. Bensahel's assessment here as well. I think it's very interesting the degree to which we didn't talk too much about doctrine yet, but the degree to which the Ukrainians have actually been assembling and developing doctrine on the fly to employ new technologies that in many cases they didn't have before the war, whether they be drones or Javelin missiles or, emerging social media connectivity, Starlink, all these other systems that they've actually integrated into their war fighting doctrine as they were fighting, which is extraordinarily hard to do. And I'm not sure the US military would be that adept at taking a whole range of different commercial off-the-shelf foreign inserted enterprises into its fighting force in the midst of a war and actually be able to use that to reasonably good effect. And the Ukrainians have just, I think, stunned all of us in their ability to integrate and mesh all of these things together. The information war, in effect, is being, I think, won hands down by them because, they have the ability to stay up on the net. They are using a lot of commercial technology. They can link their social media, essentially into the international media at will. And, they've had I think an incredibly skillful psychological operations campaign really aimed towards the West and building support and building sympathy for their cause. That is certainly one of the factors why, NATO has been as energized as it has been, and the United States and in various Western countries have provided as much aid and have actually made the decisions they've made in the last, 4+ months to support Ukraine. So it's very, very impressive. On the flip side of that, I think the Russians have fallen short in almost all those categories. Their doctrine, as Mike points out, they actually haven't really been employing their doctrine. They didn't, arguably, they did not actually, fight in accordance with their doctrine at the beginning. They certainly didn't fight in combined arms teams, which is a fundamental of any modern military, particularly armored forces doctrine. And they suffered very grievously as a result of that. They also have not had to integrate, frankly, all of the new innovations, the new technologies, the new capabilities that the Ukrainians have had to put into their force structure, into their fighting doctrine in order to survive. The Russians have been really fighting with the equipment they began the war with. So there has not been a great deal of technological innovation there, although we may be starting to see some of the beginnings of that. And then in the leadership domain, I think clearly so far, the war is being won by Ukrainian leadership from the strategic level, President Zelensky, all the way down to the tactical level. And the Russians have struggled there as well. You can assess Vladimir Putin's degree of success on the international stage, I think, by today's announcements out of NATO in the summit, and all the way down to the tactical level where they've lost some of a sizable number of their general officers. They've replaced them in some cases with retirees and reservists. And at the tactical level of fighting, we're not seeing anything that really jumps out as effective Russian tactical leadership. So I think in some ways they're struggling, but the longer the war goes on, I would argue, the more likely they are to slowly adapt and bring some of their stronger capabilities to bear.
Mr. Kofman, or if you can build off of that, because it is interesting that we've seen the memes out there of sort of the emotional support armor and the cope cages as being evidence of Russia's failed adaptation in this conflict. I'm curious what you're seeing, to General Barno's comments, but also based on Russian past performance, be it Georgia 2008, be it Chechnya, be it Crimea 2014. Is the Russian military structured or incentivized for adaptation on the battlefield, or is it a much more plotting sort of strategic adaptation?
Yeah, so look, let's be frank that a lot of commentary you see are by people looking at social media and things that are on Twitter and things reposted from TikTok and Telegram. That's not really analysis. That's a very stylized picture of the war. No offense to everybody out there, Twitter isn't real, or let's put it this way, it's a particular alternate reality, yeah? So when we look at
your Twitter feed is what is actually going on. It's the best out there.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I'm not sure mine is that real either, because I debate half of it with myself, but when you look at the adaptation question, so on the one hand, it is sort of commonly known, and perhaps almost to the extent that it's tropish, that in the Russian military, creativity is much more at the operational strategic level, that the Russian military is tactically rigid and is meant to be tactically rigid, because from the Russian point of view, that's the best way to manage the tiered readiness force they have and the force quality they're working with. Only in recent years has there begun to be a direction in Russia, a very nascent one, towards something where there's more creativity and adaptation expected at the tactical level. That part's true. But wars drive adaptations whether or not a military likes it, wants it, or wanted to reward that in the first place. Because once soldiers are on the battlefield and lots of things go wrong, and in this case for the Russian military, a lot went wrong. And so one of the biggest ones, of course, the inability to scale. What's different about this war when we compare it to other wars, Russia-Georgia war, and Chechen wars, even Russian war with Ukraine 14-15 or Syrian, what have you. So Russian military is having a lot of challenges and problems. They're not the same necessarily as what happened in the Georgia war or in the two Chechen wars, but there are some similarities. They're just the causes are a bit different. That said, the biggest difference is this is a much larger war. And what the Russian military showed it could do with 10 to 12 battalion tactical groups, it couldn't do with 130 plus, because scaling is a massive challenge. It's a massive hurdle for many militaries to climb. For some militaries, moving 3 battalions at the same time is a heroic accomplishment, okay? For the Russian military, an invasion of 150,000 troops on 3 fronts, organized into 4 different operational task forces with 6 to 7 axes of advance, which is not very sound military strategy, the way they pursued it, that was something they clearly couldn't do. Okay, that said, you clearly see strategic adaptation because they reorganized the whole effort around something they felt they could achieve. They then try to reconstitute a force that they can actually effectively control and supply in the fight, a smaller force, but a much more operationally manageable theater. They fired a lot of people, both for performance reasons and for reasons related to what happened at the outset of the war, because when the war began, the Russian military discovered what all large institutional militaries discover, that there's rot in the system that they didn't quite know about themselves until day one of the war. And sure enough, there's people padding readiness that couldn't fix on time. There's people failing on maintenance and sustainment. Corruption had effects in certain areas of maintenance as well. Those sorts of things that the military discovers, rot suddenly emerges, right? Some things that people may have known about, may have suspected, but as soon as you launch a large military operation, that becomes clear. But on the whole, I do see areas of tactical adaptation in the Russian military. I'm happy to get into some of them. And you do see actually the Russian military in some ways converging with the Ukrainian military in trying to use commercial off-the-shelf technology and marry it to the rest of the conventional equipment they have, adjusting TTPs, and essentially once the force takes enough attrition and takes significant levels of losses, it is forced to adapt. And the folks that are on the battlefield are those who have found ways of adapting, right? And they're much more wiser to the challenges of that modern battlefield. And some of the things you might find, I won't go on too long, but in Nora's and Dave's article, for example, how do you hide on the battlefield with a proliferation of high fidelity sensors that are cheap and disposable? And you see everybody struggling that on both sides of this war, right? How do you do it? Because nobody's doctrine actually has it in there. By the way, my own personal view, and this might be a debatable point, US doctrine doesn't have this in it either. All the TTPs are really for camouflage and concealment on a battlefield of 20 plus years ago. To be perfectly honest with you. How are you going to hide from these kind of sensors, from IR? Most soldiers you see are really struggling with us and trying to figure out what they can do. What are they going to do? And so I also very much worry that US military can take over self-validating lessons and thinking the Russian military is doing poorly because the Russian military is a bad army. The US military wouldn't have these problems because the US military is a good army. And I tell you, that is not true. The US military may be a good army, but it's going to have a lot of problems if it ever comes up with anyone who is competent and has a parity of capability like this, okay? And also has the motivation to sustain the fight. So there are challenges here that really have to be examined because the US military also has these kind of problems or would have doctrinal problems.
That's fantastic. I do very much want to get to that, but before we jump to sort of the lessons for the US Army side and the US military side, Dr. Bensahel, I'm curious if we can explore a little bit. One of the things that I think has been interesting, and you mentioned at the outset, the Ukrainian integration of capabilities and doctrine, both off the shelf and Western assistance. We've seen the Javelins, the NLAWs, and various anti-air systems, which are so that man-portable and seem almost on the tactical level side. But now the conversation has shifted to where we're talking about more advanced pieces of equipment like the HIMARS and advanced systems. I'm curious if you see the potential for a lagging indicator in terms of the adaptation integration of these capabilities, given that they are more complex, and what is that presage for the battlefield?
Well, I think you pointed it out correctly. The more complicated the weapon systems, the longer it's going to take the Ukrainians, or, you know, if we're looking towards lessons, any future security partner, right? The more complicated equipment that you're sharing with your partner or ally, the longer it's going to take them to get comfortable with it. You know, we're seeing that now. The United States is really being led by the Biden administration, is being very careful about what advanced weapons they want Ukraine to have. We saw this with the op-ed that President Biden wrote a couple of weeks ago, basically saying what the US will and will not do in Ukraine. We are deliberately, as a matter of strategy, the United States is limiting the types of capabilities that Ukraine can have on the battlefield, precisely because it does not want to do anything that could conceivably trigger escalation with Russia directly and increase the likelihood that Russia gets into a conflict with the United States. And that is limiting some of the advanced technologies that the Ukrainians really want. But even so, the capabilities that we are sharing are more complicated than the ones in the past, you know, partly because of the Russian problems that Michael has so well identified in the first phase of the war, that the weaponry, the advanced weapons like we're seeing now weren't as essential. But when you're talking about a large-scale war of attrition out in the East, you needed those advanced capabilities. From what I understand, the United States is making every effort to provide the Ukrainians as much support and training on these new systems as possible. But I think a lot of that is starting to enter the battlefield now, even though it was announced, 3 to 4 weeks ago. Whether that has the potential to fundamentally shift the dynamics on the battlefield, I don't know. The Ukrainians had asked for much longer range missile systems than the United States provided, again, as an effort to, limit the Ukrainian ability to target Russian territory, which then might, or threaten Russian territory, which might bring Russia in. I think it will certainly make a difference on the battlefield. The Ukrainians will be as well trained as it is possible to be in the middle of a large-scale war of attrition to bring on that new technology. But we'll see ultimately whether its operational impact is enough to break that war of attrition. I'm not confident it will be.
General Barno, I'd want to reference the piece that you and Dr. Bensahel had written recently. I think it was possibly yesterday, the War on the Rocks piece about the lessons learned in particular, and that Mr. Kofman had referenced. You talk about the risk of drawing almost the wrong lessons for it and what lessons we should be looking forward to the future. I'm curious what the biggest concerns that you have as we look at and analyze the conflict. I think Mr. Kofman said it fantastically, whereas it's not a function of just the Russian military, but the drone and the transparent battlefield is a Western military challenge as well. If you could elaborate on sort of that War on the Rocks piece, I'd be very interested to get your thoughts on those lessons.
Yeah, we absolutely are concerned as Michael is about the U.S. Army drawing the wrong lessons or being so overconfident in its capabilities that it simply doesn't see itself in what the Russians are enduring right now in Ukraine. And I think that that would be a very serious shortfall indeed. In our book, we actually wrote about a similar situation in 1939 and 1940, where the most powerful army in the world at that time, the French army, watched the Germans invade Poland in September 1939, overwhelm the Poles in about 7 weeks, and then declare war along with Britain on Germany, and then sit on their laurels throughout the winter as the Germans refine their techniques, practice, learn from what they did wrong in Poland, with the French army believing absolutely that the only reasons that the Poles lost is because they were the Poles, and it would never happen to the French. The French army is the best in the world. I mean, this echoes exactly what we hear often, even from our political leaders, about the United States Army, the U.S. military. So I think the hubris is an incredibly dangerous factor that the U.S. military will be very challenged to overcome, and look very hard at itself to see where it may be suffering the same kind of problems. You pointed out one, the inability to hide. There's no way that you can conceal formations on the battlefield today from the multispectral different imaging capabilities that any modern adversary can bring to the fight, some of which can be bought commercially from service providers who have low-cost satellites in orbit all over the world now. That's certainly going to be a challenge. And we're also starting to see the prospects of artificial intelligence being able to identify patterns of military movements that predict where command posts are going to be, where aircraft are going to be located, where formations are going to be, lagered up for logistic support. These are things that never existed on previous battlefields. And again, as Michael pointed out, that's not going to be averted by putting a camouflage net up over your command post. This is a very, very dangerous situation. So we found a number of different lessons in there. I think one of the things we said is the U.S. Army ought to be looking at Europe as its first priority, not the Pacific, where it's been focused very much for the last really 10 years, trying to carve out a role for itself in a potential conflict with China. That is going to be the most dangerous conflict in the United States. There are at least 3 other services that ought to look at that as their priority threat. The Army is not one of them in our view, because the land war in Europe is where the Army is best suited to bring its talents to bear. We talked about the dangers of not being able to hide. We talked about the dangers of the Army being very reliant on its helicopter fleet, and it's about to buy 2 brand new helicopter rotary wing systems for its future that we think are in some ways already obsolete, because they're going to be detectable, they're going to be readily destroyed by an adversary that's got modern capabilities, which the Army has never had to operate its helicopters against since it began using them really in Vietnam. Never had to deal with an adversary air force, and certainly not with advanced air defenses. That's likely to be out there on a battlefield in the future. And we also talked about, finally, that the Army is going to have to be resilient enough to continue to fight when it takes the kind of heavy attrition that we're seeing both on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side. We have not seen that kind of attrition since the Vietnam War, over 50 years ago. And the U.S. military and the U.S. Army in particular is not built, is not trained, isn't practiced in the techniques of rebuilding its units and being able to continue to fight after taking heavy casualties. I'll let perhaps Dr. Bensahel talk about one of the good success stories there, if she'd like to, and what we think that the U.S. Army has done well that has contributed, for a moment.
Well, the positive story is U.S. security force assistance, particularly to Ukraine. We can get back to that in a moment, but I wanted to make a broad observation before we move on. The United States is far more likely to look like Russia in future conflicts than the Ukrainians, not out of any ideological affinity, of course, and U.S. military forces are obviously, much more adaptable, have, the philosophy of mission command, so we're not rigid. I don't mean in that sense. I mean more in a strategic sense. Unless we're talking about an operation directly in the territory of the United States, the U.S. military operates abroad, right? And so we are going to be going into someone else's country with a population that in some cases might be friendly towards the U.S., but in many cases might not be. Imagine, a scenario that pops up from time to time about the U.S. in Iran, for example, or in a major conflict, really anywhere in the world. We may be in a position where the locals don't want to see us, even though we decide it's in our national interest to intervene, and they're going to be the ones with the cell phones, and they're going to be the ones sharing the information about where we are, and we're going to be the ones with long logistics tails that have to be defended. So again, I don't mean to make an exact parallel. I think we are a far more capable military than the Russians, but the types of operational problems that the Russians have faced, the ones that are not of their own making, are likely to be ones that face the United States military on a future battlefield. I think all three of us share a great concern that the US military, and particularly the Army, because this is a large-scale conventional land war among relatively advanced countries that it's going on, that the US Army has a long way to go to be fully prepared for this kind of conflict and the lessons of what we're seeing daily on the battlefield.
Mr. Kofman, I want to build off of what General Barno and Dr. Bensahel have referenced. It seems that one of the underpinning challenges and questions that goes into this in almost any future conflict is really a question of force design and force structure, that you're preparing for a type of conflict and then you find yourself potentially in a different type of conflict. You wrote in the War on the Rocks piece with Rob Lee, the Russian military is well suited to short, high-intensity campaigns defined by heavy use of artillery. By contrast, it is poorly designed for sustained occupation or grinding war of attrition that would require a large share of Russia's ground forces, which is exactly the conflict it has found itself in. I'm curious how those choices have impacted where it is today, but also have impacted the potential for Russia's adaptation in this conflict. And then I want to turn to General Barno and Dr. Bensahel, and what do those lessons say for the American force structure?
Sure, I'm happy to take that on. So as always, I tend to gravitate, I guess, to what my bias tells me tends to be most important. Force structure, force design. I'm one of those people that basically says, show me your force structure and I'll tell you who you are. Military's come up with lots of innovative operational concepts and ideas and whatnot, but the force structure is often more revelatory about what they really invested in and kind of being able to do. And ideas in that regard really matter because all these choices have trade-offs, right? Strategy is about trade-offs, what you choose to do versus what you choose not to do. And the Russian military made significant trade-offs in force design. They were principally conscious choices. They had essentially assumed that they need to prepare a military for a short, potentially sharp, high-intensity conflict, first and foremost with NATO. They figured that strategic ground offensives were a thing of the past, that they didn't need substantial manpower or logistics for them, that they wouldn't be fighting or trying to hold large amounts of terrain. And they also didn't set themselves up particularly for urban combat either, right? Because if you look kind of at the potential terrain of a Russian-NATO fight, it doesn't feature a lot of that territory. And they tried to learn or at least overconsume the lessons of the wars of the last 30 years. Gulf War, U.S. other invasion of Iraq, Yugoslavia campaign, whatnot, and basically saw it as principally as an air power problem, as a problem of dealing with U.S. precision-guided weapons, or net-centric warfare, and the like. Okay, so where did that lead them? They built a tier readiness force that was supposed to be able to generate a percentage of its combat potential, a short notice, and then they kind of had this presumption about a hedge, that in the event of a large conflict, a big war, that there would be several months to prepare, they would be able to mobilize and raise manning levels, which is kind of like an intellectual alibi for what they ended up doing, which was they started building out more and more force structure, but they weren't hiring up people to fill it. And so so how do you square that circle? Just lower readiness and keep telling yourself that in the event war, there's this other kind of part of the pie that you'll get access to and you'll be able to get this manpower. And so they got back into the addiction of buying metal and capability, but not necessarily having the readiness. And as they expanded the number of battalion tactical groups, the way they were doing that is by cutting the actual amount of personnel in them. So they were actually quite smaller on average than even folks like me and you were assumed, right? And what was in them wasn't necessarily the right mix of soldiers in terms of making them combat effective. So the combat credible force in the Russian military kept shrinking. And guess what? Tiered readiness also sets up the wrong incentives because it then sets up incentives for people to cheat on readiness, right? About what is their share of contract servicemen versus conscripts, about how many people they really have in that mix, and what's actually ready and good to go in the event of short notice, because they're supposed to be able to deploy, let's say, within 48 hours. And the other part's also significant too, because they dramatically cut the infantry in the force. They cut the infantry, and they really cut dismounted infantry and light infantry. And so they went back to some respects to a force that was very problematic in the First Chechen War, where they had a lot of tanks, a lot of infantry fighting vehicles, but nobody getting out of them, right? And the best elite infantry took massive casualties in the first part of the war, and very quickly the Russian military found itself without the infantry to be able to do combined arms, without the infantry to engage in urban combat. Because how can tanks or other vehicles support a fight in urban context? There's no real dismounted infantry in that fight, right? And that also shows you why the Russian military ended up sticking to roads. And it also showed you why the Russian military had some of the struggles with combined arms. Because if you're really short on one of those combined arms elements, there's not a lot of infantry for the rest of the force to interact with or to hold that terrain. Anyway, I won't go further down this except to say that those were choices, those were trade-offs they made, and they didn't have a good hedge. And the Russian military was put into a war that really played to its weaknesses and minimized its strengths. And you've seen in the second phase them trying to adjust for that, pursue an attrition war, because the Russian military is more of an artillery army with lots of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. And to basically then focus on fires, try to mobilize personnel to compensate for the lack of dismounted infantry, and to pursue this campaign much more slowly in a way where fires are decisive and they don't have to try to execute combined arms nearly as much, given both the lack of forces, the lower quality force, and the big deficits in the force. But many of those problems were born of the force structure and the design ideas they went with and the big trade-offs within them, right? And to be honest, all forces have those kind of choices, and they all have trade-offs they've made.
That's a fantastic point, because it also, I think, fits to a question that we're seeing in the United States right now. And Dr. Bensahel, I'd love for you to jump in on this one. The recent debate and sort of furor over the Force Design 2030 for the United States Marine Corps and the future of the Corps for the Indo-Pacific. I'm curious what your thoughts are and how we're seeing almost a debate about adaptation in a time when the military really wasn't looking at, and please correct me if I'm wrong, returning to Europe. I mean, we haven't had like a reforger exercise in a very long time, although it's started to pivot back towards Europe. How do we balance that with the lessons that we're seeing? So we want to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. We're having to go back to focusing on Europe and make decisions on the force structure based on what we're seeing in the battlefield. What is your takeaway from what we're learning right now?
Well, here I'd really distinguish between the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army as having very different focuses moving forward. And I think that's probably, given the set of trade-offs and the fact that the United States needs to think seriously about both theaters, I think having the Marines focus on the Pacific is probably the right choice to make. General Berger, the commandant of the Marine Corps in the past couple of years, has unleashed a really transformational vision of where he wants the Marine Corps to go to become much more of the naval service that it was originally and that it has gotten away from while it's been helping fight the wars of the past 2 decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's faced a tremendous amount of pushback. The number of retired Marine 4-stars that have come out against this is remarkable in a service where the culture is that just doesn't happen. But I think that shows the magnitude of the changes that he's trying to make in order to get the Marine Corps ready for the types of wars that it might fight in the Pacific. Getting rid of all of its tanks is something that is a good idea if you're trying to focus on the Pacific theater, where we're going to have much more of a maritime expeditionary role as a Marine-based land force. The Army, however, is a different story. And again, we've mentioned this a couple of times, but one of the things that we argue very strongly in our piece is that the Army has to get back to focusing on Europe as its highest priority for all of the reasons we've talked about. And that's, to me, that is just doubled down on by the statements and the new strategic concept coming out of NATO today, talking about the real threats in Europe in a way that NATO has never done before. Even during the Cold War, it was a little more calibrated in what it said about the Soviet Union than the concept that came out today. So, the Army has been, for the past several years, really focused on the Pacific and the role it would play in the Pacific. I think, frankly, part of that was a bid for relevance in a world where the United States was focusing more strategically on the Pacific. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, nobody was giving a whole lot of credence to the fact that Russia could pose such a threat until the very last minute when the invasion actually happened. So I think that, the Army has to move from thinking about the Pacific as its primary theater. It will still have, the Army does a whole lot of things that aren't infantry, fighting, that aren't combat fighting. It provides a lot of enablers for the rest of the force, and it will certainly have to provide those in any Pacific contingency. But the combat forces of the Army need to be oriented primarily towards Europe. And again, because of the priority the US has placed on the Pacific, that's not a comfortable place for the Army. That's not necessarily a place that they want to be. But given that, the US military is relatively small compared to the types of challenges we're asking it to take on, I think that kind of specialization where the Marine Corps really is the primary force for land operations and other things as well in the Pacific, and the combat power of the Army is focused on Europe, is really where that division of labor has to be.
General Barno, if I can ask you to jump in on this one, because we've seen in the news, obviously, the expansion, the enlargement of the alliance with Finland and Sweden, and a renewed emphasis as part of the strategic document that came out today on the partnerships and investment in European security amongst the alliance. How do you see that changing as a function of what lessons are being drawn from the present conflict? And is that going to adjust the force structure and design? Is it going to adjust the doctrinal approach to it? And what do you see changing?
I could probably talk to that more from a U.S. perspective than from the European perspective. I think it is notable that in the announcements today that the NATO Rapid Response Force is going to go from ostensibly 40,000 to 300,000, although there was some question about where all those forces are going to come from. That's a massive change in terms of NATO's ability to respond quickly to a now clearer Russian threat in the east. We also saw announcements made by President Biden today about the U.S. now deciding to permanently station troops in Poland, not simply rotational forces, but put a permanent headquarters there, which looks like it's going to be the Army's 5th Corps headquarters, which long ago was stationed in Germany as part of the force during the Cold War, and to have some perhaps permanent combat forces in addition to ramping up the number of rotational combat forces there. I also find it interesting that these are Army decisions in terms of what's going to be put in Europe, and there's a reason for that. As Dr. Bensahel pointed out, Europe is a continental theater. It's a land-centric theater. A fight there is a land-centric fight. The Pacific is a maritime theater, and a fight there is primarily an air and maritime fight. And even, General Mark Milley, Army 4-star Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has explicitly said that a few years ago. One of the takeaways for the U.S., I think, very clearly is that prior to the invasion of Ukraine, in some ways, the U.S. military, I think, was trying to design a military strategy focused on fighting a war in the Pacific. In Europe would be a lesser included case. If you could do it in the Pacific, you could apply it in Europe. And I think that's flat wrong. And I think the conflict in Ukraine and the rich number of lessons that are already spilling out of that conflict about land warfare tell us that what I've designed for a maritime theater is not necessarily the same kind of force structure, force design I want to have for a land-centric theater. So the reality for the U.S. military writ large is that there are 2 base cases the U.S. has to be prepared to prosecute. One in the Pacific against in a primarily maritime theater against a very distinct, unique threat there, and one in Europe in mostly a land continental-centric theater against a unique threat that's very, very different than the Pacific threat. And you can't simply have one force that very easily shifts back and forth with the same priorities for each service for each. I just don't think that works. And so the Army I think it's actually too early to learn distinct lessons yet about force structure for even land forces from this conflict. I think as this continues to play out, we're getting insights and glimmers of what might come. But I think when the conflict is over, the Army in particular is going to have to look at what's the big takeaways here for land warfare, and where have we gone down the wrong path in terms of how we're thinking about land warfare focused on the Pacific and the Army in the Pacific, and how does that bring us back to our roots in a real land conflict in Europe, and what does that mean about the kind of force structure we have and what we're planning for? That's going to be a very tough discussion for the Army to have internally.
Mr. Kofman, I think you wanted to jump in and add something on the U.S. Army aspect, and then we do have a pair of questions from the audience I want to get to.
Sure, I just had 2 brief comments. First, I want to kind of echo the sentiment about learning lessons. The initial lessons from any conflict are usually broad. They're based on very limited information. They're imperfect. We often find ourselves still debating what happened in World War I and World War II, and barely 100 days into this war, people often draw early sweeping conclusions about what they think they might have seen. but usually that is going to be dispelled over time. And so only now we're starting to learn a lot more about just the opening phase of the war and the first month of it, and you just have to be patient with it. And the only other comment I'd like to make about the U.S. Army, I fully agree, not to dismiss the importance of the Pacific theater. I often kind of come down to that somewhat joking interaction with bank robber Willie Sutton, who was asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. And so the question is, why should the U.S. Army focus on the European theater? Because that's where the land is, okay? That's where the land war principally is. And so as much as the Army has to consider the Pacific theater as important, you can't get away from that.
Can I just jump in quickly, Michael? I completely agree with you on the danger of learning lessons too early, but I would say that there still are some trends that we can see on the battlefield that we know are still going to be around, right? Like, and as we've all talked about, the lack of the lack of transparency and the inability to hide on the battlefield. We don't know how that's going to play out in terms of force structure. How do you try to address it? I think all of those things are lessons for the future, but we can see right now what some of the parameters of future major conventional conflict is going to look like on the battlefield, and we can start identifying those trends and see what they might mean for U.S. forces. Even though I agree, the specific lessons and how you change your force structure, how you change your doctrine, all of those things, I think there will be a lot of lessons still to come on those things.
Sure, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's also great that we're already trying to correct some of the early self-validating lessons that people took from the first month, right, in the U.S. Army and other parts of the force, saying Ukrainians are doing well because they're like us, which actually isn't really that true. Russians are doing bad because they're not like us, which also isn't really necessarily the case. And now articles like yours are starting to lay out what they think are some of the more cogent lessons. This, what can you take that you can generalize from this to the contemporary features, sort of modern warfare and the like?
That's a fantastic point. I want to jump in and ask, we have a question from Mr. Byron Callan, and this one I'm going to put to you, Mr. Kofman. What will Russia's military look like in 2023, 2025, particularly if the export controls work? How should the US and Europe adapt to that threat? So I guess as a function of potential rearmament challenges, and how might the Russian military adapt to those limitations?
Well, it's a hard question because you're in the midst of a war and it all depends on what happens in this war, right? Sort of like, we're past Battle of Frontiers and First Battle of the Marne, and the question is, what's the British military going to look like 4 years from now? And all these events have yet to happen. So I guess the only intelligent things I might be able to say is first that probably the Russian military is going to rebuild to an extent faster than folks think. It may not necessarily rebuild itself the same. In the categories of most advanced military capabilities, the ones I think we worried most about in the United States, they've lost very little or nothing at all in terms of many of those capabilities. In the categories of ground forces, they've lost quite a bit. They've lost a significant part of armored fighting vehicles, and they've substantially damaged the force, and they lost a lot of the best people in the force. And I don't know how long it'll take to rebuild the force. I can guess that it might take, let's say, up to 5 years, one state armament program, to try to rebuild the ground force component of it, depending on what they choose to do with it. On export controls, they will definitely slow that process down, but they are not a silver bullet, okay? And a lot of the things that the Russian military really needs, like electronic circuitry, right, chips, optics, some of those elements, well, it may not come back as the same quality force, but they may be able to get around through those export controls, because a lot of things they buy are in secondary markets that nobody controls in terms of resale. If you think that it's very easy, I encourage you to assess the last 10 years of North Korea's missile programs and Iran's, and you can answer whether you feel that Treasury's export controls have substantially shut those down, or if they seem to have advanced considerably and have a greater diversity of missiles than they ever had before. And then try to judge to what extent Russia, which has much greater resources, much greater connections and the like, might be able to get around them. So it's too early to tell. That's the honest answer. Here's just at least some aspects of it I can comment on.
Dr. Bensahel, I want to pivot to a bigger question about the ability of the U.S. Army and the Department of Defense to pivot to changes in the environment. Your book, which I thought was fantastic, talks very much about the tactical level adaptations that we saw, and to a certain degree operational level adaptations, but the services writ large were very slow to change. I mean, World War II is a good example, but then later on, certainly in Afghanistan and Iraq, it seemed to be considerably slower than World War II. I'm curious, as you discussed about the Army needing to pivot more towards Europe, the fact that we're still learning the lessons, and in some cases learning the wrong lessons, how you see the ability of the service to change and pivot towards this new sort of post-Ukraine environment, even though we're not after Ukraine.
Change is hard for any institutions, right? But it's particularly hard for militaries because of all of the uncertainties of the future battlefield, the fog and friction on the battlefield that you never know exactly what you're going to face. And the fact that, at the end of the day, national existence can be at stake, as we're seeing in Ukraine, right? So, I have some sympathy. It's hard to change a military organization, particularly from the top. But as you point out, we explore in our book how well the military adapted at the most senior levels over the past 20 years of war, and found some truly horrendous failures. Particularly when you look at the willingness of the army bureaucracy in one example to get a life-saving technology into the hands, well, not really into the hands, life-saving vehicles into Iraq and then belatedly Afghanistan to respond to what was then a new threat of these improvised explosive devices. And looking particularly at intelligence software where the Army stood by its platform of record, which was known as D6A, even though the Palantir software was being used by the Marines to save lives, despite that real world example. I think part of that was these were not the type of wars that the US Army necessarily wanted to fight. We talk about that in the book, The Legacy of Vietnam, and we will never do insurgency again. So I think that, pivoting for the Army now from a focus on China back to a focus on Europe will certainly be easier than some of that, right? The big fight in Europe is what the US Army planned to do for the entire Cold War. It has some historical roots there, although of course the generations have passed. You don't have anybody except at the very highest levels of the rank structure who served during the Cold War. Even now, you have to have been in the service for 30 or more years to have served even in the waning days of the Cold War. So institutionally, there's a lot left to rebuild, but there's an institutional history there that I'm hoping will make it not as difficult to pivot. Frankly, what's going to make it relatively easier than it might be under other circumstances is that Congress seems to be throwing a tremendous amount of money at the Defense Department, even more than the Biden administration asked for, and I think even more than many outside observers like myself who knew that Congress was going to up the amount of money. I still didn't see the kind of money that they're talking about. They still haven't settled on the budget for the fiscal year that starts in October, fiscal 23, but the committees have recently been talking about a defense budget of $830 billion, which is more, I don't remember the exact numbers off of the top of my head, but I think is more than 100 billion than what the Biden administration requested, something on that order of magnitude. So as long as the money is flowing freely in the defense budget, it becomes not that difficult to make these choices and transitions, right? Because you can spend money on lots of things. You don't have to make as hard choices. You always have to make hard choices, right? Strategy is the art of making choices and taking risk. As Michael said, you never have enough resources to do everything you want to do. But you can do some of this and some of that while budget resources are flowing. If the defense budget were more constrained or shrinking, I think it would be a far harder challenge. It's easier to say we can keep doing what we're doing in the Pacific and add on some for this grave threat that we're now facing in Russia than it would be if the Army had to really sit down and say, okay, now what can we still do in the Pacific? How much do we have to pivot? How do we allocate those very limited defense dollars? So as long as the defense dollars are flowing, there's lots of waste and unnecessary things that come with that, but it also makes it easier for an institution to take on new things. But the downside is it means it's not shedding the old things. And that may be a challenge as we go forward as well.
General Barno, would you have to jump in on that? Because I mean, over the course of your career, you've seen the service have to change several times to several different iterations of threats. What's your take on that?
I think the institutional bureaucracies of the services, and this is true of all the services, are extremely conservative and extremely slow to move. And in my experience, unless they and the nation are faced with an existential threat to utter defeat, they are going to stonewall and continue to do as much as possible what they've always been doing. And I've seen this. We certainly saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan. A few months after I came back from Afghanistan, in the early days of the war in 2005, I sat in a briefing in the Army staff with a group of generals. And the briefer started by saying, U.S. Central Command requirements, meaning the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The war is keeping the Army from optimizing its force generation model. And I put my hand and said, I don't think that that's actually the way to look at this. I think the force generation model is actually designed to support the war, not the war should be supporting the force generation model, because the service was consumed with the idea that it was having to feed all these requirements for overseas commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was screwing up the rotation plans of the Army. It was screwing up the training base. It was putting priorities on things that the Army didn't want to be priorities for funding. And this seems almost comical to describe at this point in time, but it was very clear, and again, this is back in the 05 timeframe, that the service was not interested in redesigning where it was going, its future force structure, its future weaponry, to be able to optimize the fight for today. It wanted to work on the fight 10 or 15 years from now. And so I think, again, unless the country's at deep in imminent risk, it's very difficult for the services to see what they were doing is not correct, and that a shift needs to be made in a new direction, and the ability to make that quickly. There simply are so many incentives out there to prevent that. It's really extraordinarily difficult to ever see that happen.
Mr. Kofman, I want to go to you for one of the final questions before going to the group for sort of roundup thoughts. One of the key components that Dr. Bensahel and General Barno wrote about is that leadership aspect of adaptation. How are we seeing, or do we even have enough evidence and insight into how Russians and Ukrainians are identifying and promoting leaders in the battlefield? There was a considerable discussion about the appointment of the new general when they pivot to Eastern Ukraine. I think it was the moniker like the butcher of Syria or something ridiculous like that. But I'm curious, are they promoting innovators? Is it just basically a function of those who are surviving? And what does that mean going forward?
Sure. So on leadership, to me, what tends to matter more is leadership at the kind of company, battalion, and regimental level. And that's where the Russian military lost a lot of good officers. And it will take them time to replace that cadre. Regarding generals, well, they've lost quite a few major generals, although in the Russian military, it's fairly common for the senior officers to be up front on the battlefield, trying to personally manage forces and actually reconnoiter the battlefield themselves. They tend to operate much more forward. Even in case we don't have to, you saw several senior officers lost by Russian forces in Syria, right? Just because of how they prefer to command their forces, and they were much more easily targeted in that regard by the Ukrainians. But to your question about leadership, so the Russian military has reorganized leadership several times in this fight. Probably the most consistent person that I've seen coordinating the operational level task groupings has been the head of the main directorate of operations in the general staff, right? So there's a new general who's the overall commander, there's another general who's the overall commander, and so on and so forth. And you could assign successes to leadership changes, but there's not necessarily great evidence of that either, to be perfectly honest. It's a bit too early to tell if that's really what's making a difference. The only thing that can be said about the Russian military is that they are clearly firing and relieving officers largely based on performance, particularly performance in the first phase of the war, and also failures to successfully prosecute offensive and manage the forces in the second phase too. So there's a military that is trying to deal with that, and they relieved quite a few officers. It's not just a question of officers being attrition. To what extent that's made a difference versus the changes they made in the force or the other ways they reorganized, it'll take years to unpack that. And of course, will be many debates like there are in any other wars. Was it the individual leadership of the general that was decisive? Was it the leadership of the folks under them that was decisive? Was it the logistics and the other aspects of the operation that actually changed and improved, right? And you can debate. Success is usually multi-causal. That's kind of my view. Failure often is too. Although usually it gets blamed on the person in charge, but failure often is multi-causal as well. But yeah, that's my take on it.
We're just about running out of time for our discussion. This has been absolutely fantastic. I do want to give a chance for the three of you to sort of add any sort of final thoughts and remarks on what you're going to be looking for in terms of adaptation for Ukraine and Russia in sort of the coming months of the conflict. If you sort of any final thoughts. So Dr. Bensahel, I'll go with you first.
Sure. Well, as we've been talking about, the war is now a war of attrition in the East. And that's not going to be something that ends quickly. It's going to, as Michael has noted, it's going to continue to create horrendous numbers of casualties on both sides. you know, once you get into that stage, you know, sometimes adaptation can help break a stalemate. You figure out a new way to do things that can help you get through that. But it's hard, even that is hard to do in a war of attrition. Although obviously the side that has, you know, the better ability to adapt will have advantages on that battlefield. So what I'm going to be looking for is, you know, anything that seems to be breaking that stalemate, although not the stalemate, but that continued attrition. I mean, Russia has now taken over good chunks of the East. Whether it can hold that territory and whether the parts of the territory that it had held in other parts as it's focused its forces in the East, whether those the Ukrainians continue to make advances there, I think, you know, a lot of that will affect the future battlefield and the dynamics of this war. It'll also be interesting to see as it goes on what the Russian sense of victory looks like, what the overall Russian objective is now, which I think is very unclear, right? At the beginning of the war, it was regime change in Ukraine and taking it over. And that's been off the table for a long time now, ever since they failed in Kyiv. What do they settle for that's less than that? I don't think anybody knows that question yet, much less Putin, but that'll be obviously critical in figuring out how and when this war ends.
General Barno, what are you going to be looking out for?
We all observe that wars are battles between adaptation and counter-adaptation, and then the counter-adaptation. That's happening in Ukraine right now. Watching if the Ukrainians get to the next level in their next adaptation is going to be something I'm going to be focused on, especially in their defensive operations, seeing what the Russians have begun to do to, offensively take advantage of the seams in the Ukrainian defensive capabilities. What's the next step for the Ukrainians? How can the West assist with that? What's the new vision of how you're going to defend? And are you going to develop some kind of a limited offensive capability within that, maybe to take some territory back and to keep the Russians on their heels? So I'll be watching for that and seeing how that plays out. The strategic outcome of this is anybody's guess right now.
Mr. Kofman, final word?
I guess the final word I'll say is that you can see that Ukrainian military currently is sort of in the capability valley of trench. But there's also a real story about the degradation of these two forces as attrition takes its hold and how they're going to adapt and adjust for that. And the one thing I'll say is that capability matters, but it's always one piece of the puzzle. Unfortunately, on the internet, you always have folks that think any particular capability, if it's good, is kind of a silver bullet. But in general, you're also looking at organizational changes and adaptations. You're looking at changes of force employment, and the military has to make a host of these adjustments for one force to ultimately prevail over another, right? And that's the only thing I would say. It's for people to have sort of mitigated expectations of the impact the HIMARS or any one particular system would make in this conflict. The same way it might make some difference, but not be a decisive factor in any other war too. There's a lot more to it than just providing capability. Maybe that might be the last useful thing I can provide, at least on my thoughts on the current situation.
Well, I'm disappointed we didn't get a chance to ask that question, because you wrote on Twitter, tech fetishism is a commonplace in defense establishments, especially ours, but capabilities are just one element among the changes or adaptations required for one military to attain victory over another. So I think you beat me to it, so it's fantastic. Mr. Kofman, General Barno, Dr. Bensahel, I can't thank you enough for joining us for this conversation today. I've learned a lot and could easily continue discussing this for many hours to come, but we've run out of time, and I'm going to turn it over to Representative Nye for final remarks.
Let me just echo Joshua's thanks to our speakers for sharing your insights on the topic of adaptation under fire. I did post the book link in the chat. I hope anyone who hasn't read it yet will take a look at it, and also keep up with our speakers' current writings, because this is a fascinating subject area. Those of us who are in academia or think tanks have the advantage over those currently in office or in uniform of being able to take a step back, reflect a little bit, think a little more long-term, and hopefully provide some thoughtful analysis that helps those who are doing the day-to-day real-time work incorporate those lessons as we go. So I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Bensahel, General Barno, and Mr. Kofman for all the intellectual capital that they're producing for the benefit of that thought process. And it's our pleasure to have you. I would look forward to having you on another discussion again soon. To our participants in the audience, thank you for joining us today. Take care.